I'm so excited to start this episode today. I have Jacob Cooper, and I want to read you a little bit about this exciting interview because this man has a lot to offer. So, Jacob is passionate about promoting healing. Jacob Cooper, best-selling author of Life After Breath and The Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder, is a sought-after speaker on grief, wisdom, and consciousness, offering meditation and mindfulness seminars to help others find purpose and overcome fears of life after death. As a clinical social worker, Reiki Master, and certified hypnotherapist specializing in past life regression, Jacob uses his extensive personal and professional experience to empower one soul at a time. He hosts a weekly podcast, The Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. Thank you so much for joining me today, Jacob. What a pleasure and an honor to have you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on your podcast here today.
It's so wonderful to see you again. For the listeners, I just actually met Jacob at a grief retreat for the Forever Family Foundation, and he was an intricate part of this retreat. And I was so happy to have met him. And I know that you offered quite a bit of healing during that retreat. For those of you who don't know what happens on the grief retreat, there are several mediums that are attending. I, of course, was one of them. But Jacob was there in a different way. And I was so happy to see that this is actually coming into what's known as mental health or clinical psychology, because he was there to offer people, grieving people, help with Reiki, meditation. You can go into this more. I wasn't allowed into these rooms, but I know that you offered healing in a way that they could do this themselves. So instead of being dependent on a medium such as myself, you were offering ways in which they could work with their grief themselves. And I'm kind of fascinated by that because I think it's really needed. But because we're in this world of, oh, this is, dealing with the afterlife or mediumship, and that's not real, we don't see it as much, but yet you are actually doing this and you have a career based on it. So let's start there if you don't mind. Talk to me about how you deal with people. I know you deal with a lot of grieving people, I've heard you say. So tell me what you do with that person and how your approach is to helping a person that's going through that or anything that they come to you for with their social work psychology.
Yeah, I know you mentioned social work and psychology. Social work, the reason why I was gravitated to it, it has a very eclectic, wide array approach, which is in psychology, a person comes into your office, you kind of just work on their mind. But in social work, a person's coming to your office, they can't pay the bills, they don't have a job, they don't have transportation. We could talk into our blue in the face, but if those avenues aren't met, how could really help a person? So it's a lot more broad based in the systems that we could help out people, what we call the micro, the person, the macro, the larger scale, and the meso, just kind of the intermediary between the two. And so that's what I love, just that system theory approach with social work that's really able to help out people in a versatile type of avenue. And that versatility, really has translated itself into really understanding, a person and environment, how different cultural and environment aspects, and having the competency of the two could really help us understand the person sitting in front of us. And so for me at least, it's important that to understand that someone might be coming into my office. They may be drowning. I may be their last hope. And let's say that person has a certain religious or spiritual belief system. Am I going to be the one to say, hey, that's schizophrenia, you're having a psychotic episode, stuff like that? Or am I going to try to empower the client to listen to the client? More importantly, to be educated to really understanding what they're going through. So my approach is yes, direct practice, but I also work behind the scenes as someone who trains other therapists to understand clients who might have different transformative experiences, which I know we'll get a little bit into, but under the umbrella of spiritual transformative experiences, that can include, stuff that you do, like mediumistic experiences or abilities, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, shared death experiences, and beyond. And so for myself, the more awareness that you have, as a clinician and other clinicians who can do that, the more likelihood is that will be that solid piece of foundation that people could hold on to, but more importantly, that they could get themselves to return back to and not need us. They could really allow themselves to propel within their life. So I guess my approach really is rooted in my training, which is to meet the client where they're at. I don't enforce my end near-death experience or belief systems on clients. My job is to leave that world behind, but there's a certain degree of self-disclosure, that's appropriate or helpful. I at times will utilize that, when a client may benefit from it from a plethora of standpoints. So it's a unique time to be in, and it's a wonderful time to be practicing where now the ostracization on this, isn't as much there, and there's more acceptance, and we're understanding that the ego isn't so much important about the cross-disciplinary fractions that we may have, but it's about the person sitting in front of us being able to help out that person in any kind of way. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you, and we have something in common in that we are both dealing with people that are really at a low point in their lives. Um, be it they've lost someone or they just feel like they don't have anything, they're hopeless. Uh, and I get that with my psychic practice as well, just people coming saying, I just don't know what to do here. I'm really at a bad place. And it seems like they have, to me, it's almost like they've forgotten something there. Like they've forgotten the essence of who they are, or they're, if you don't have purpose or you don't feel like there's anything for you, there's this disconnect there, obviously, right? So the way that you do that and I do that, of course, is really different. But I would love for you to talk about your experience. You can go into however this has happened for you, be it your NDE or your studies, but how do you speak to someone that really says like that's it? I don't think there's anything else for me. I'm here for no reason. How do you approach something like that with what you know from what you've learned? Do you feel like they've just forgotten something, like they have an essence that they've forgotten or a life that they don't understand? What do you think of that? I think it's kind of up in the air as to what people think of that.
There's a lot. I mean, when you're born in this life, you're born a perfect, many times beautiful child to hopefully loving parents, and everyone looks at you with such warmth and radiance, and you're just looked at as this golden light that has come into this world. But for some people, depending on different circumstances or different storms that people might have faced in their lives, somehow that beautiful essence gets overtaken by a different story or different narrative. And that perfect being is now portrayed, self-portrayed, or sees themselves in such a different way. And many times, through words that others will say, well, you're this, but you're not that. In order to be this, you need to do this. There's a very unstable sense of identity that people have that's very valid and rational, but ultimately not based on the true reality. And there's a great deal of forgetfulness. And so I think in today's world that in many ways has a lot of bubble wrap around it, particularly for the younger generation that avoids crisis and pain at all costs. I say, you know, that's in many ways is a segue. Our crisis, our darkness, the pain that we feel is a segue of transformation. Why would you change if you're feeling so comfortable? Sometimes these shake-up periods happen to create a wake up. I say shake up, wake up, but I think what's important is for people to really allow themselves to go there, to go to those moments and really to understand that there's a value in feeling a sense of discomfort because that could allow you to maybe reevaluate, life in a different way to look at it. And so there's a short-term, long-term dynamic when it comes to pain, and growth and evolution. As we know with the body too. I mean, you work in the you've had years working in the physical health and gym industry and everything like that,
Mm-hmm.
and you understand the elasticity of muscles and the resistance of muscles and how nature and the body is just a model for all these unseen forces. And many times when we have this elasticity through pain, there could be a lot of growth that
Yeah.
does happen. But I think obviously it's important to reminding people that what we feel today, A, is not permanent. Storms don't last forever. Obviously, allowing them to process what they feel, but eventually finding ways for people to feel, a certain degree of pain where they could find a way to really find the motivation, to look at things in a different way, you know. So that's important. But there's a lot to it. Obviously, from a mental health standpoint, we have to kind of tread water if a client is at that point,
Of
safety
course.
assessment, all that is first and foremost paramount. And obviously with the uptick of crisis and mental health acuity and suicidality
Mm-hmm.
on the increase, why that is a plethora of reasons. I mean, certainly mental health in many ways is a lot more publicized, it's a lot more aware, it's a lot more normalized, and yet the crisis has really had an uptick. And, as a therapist, I could only really philosophize, theorize that, a lot of changes, in our world the last couple of years, combined with the phones and all these other things, has added to a lot of where we're at. But, certainly science will say if you look at anything closely enough, things will have an explanation. And mental health is no different. But I think including the spiritual lens in mental health could give clients a greater asset and more explanation for crises and changes that people could have.
I think that's a perfectly said, more explanation for why. So let's go into that if you don't mind. You also said something that piqued my interest, which was there's a there's a little bit of forgetfulness on people's part. And so I'm assuming that you're talking about you're forgetting about where they come from, why they're here, things like that. But let's talk about most people probably don't know this about you unless they've read your books. You had an NDE as a young child, as a 3-year-old, due to suffocation from whooping cough, which I imagine was really traumatizing and difficult. But because of that, you did actually die for some time there, and had profound experiences and then returned. And I know a lot of people probably judge that, I want to say, on some level because you were so young. But with my experience in mediumship, it really doesn't matter whether you were 6 months old or 98 because you're returning to a consciousness. And that's it's not a 3-year-old, that's a 3-year-old body, that's a 3-year-old experience, of course, but you're returning to something that is so much greater and infinite, it's eternal. So when you visited there, I know you had your experience, which you're using now, whether they know it or not, to help people through this. But when you talk about forgetfulness, is that what you're saying, or do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think the box of how we view ourselves is our nature of reality. And there's so much association of beliefs and our worldviews and our behaviors. The two go hand in hand. And I think for many, and I'm sure you've seen this in your workshops, if you ask for people to point at themselves, they'll point at the body. Well, then you say,
Yeah.
okay, when the body's buried, then what are you? We'll point to a job. Well, that's, not permanent. Maybe to the car, maybe to the spouse, maybe to the kids. And all these things are things that we experience.
Yeah.
They're pages in the book, but they're not the entire story.
Right.
And I think people really have a hard time with that. They have a hard time understanding that they are more than a body, more than the current story that they see reality as well as the vulnerability that comes with that understanding that most people, for a lot of people, it takes a lot of vulnerability to change or maybe to look at life in a new lens. They'd rather look at the story that they're at, and maybe it's not a healthy one or a productive one, but that's what they're complacent with, and that's fine. But I give an analogy, like the world right now, the planet that we're on, it would not be what it is today if people were not daring to stretch the imagination or the reality that people had that said it's a flat earth. That's all that there is. That's all that there
Mm-hmm.
was, will be
Mm-hmm.
for a time. And then through challenging that notion, we found no, that's not the case, and this is a whole different planet now. I think on a microcosm for each individual to have that same paradigm shift, it's possible in their own lives, and it's a beautiful change. But you have to, in order to change, there's a vulnerability that comes with it, but great reward. But certainly, I think that gets in the way of people's stories because if they just see themselves as the body, then that's all there is. And that I certainly think my near-death experience was there as a lesson for other people to really see and understand that we're more than our genders, our ages, our personalities. That's certainly a part of our story, but there's a greater story that occurred beyond this life. There's a greater story that will occur after it. The chapter that we're writing, could certainly elevate, enhance it. But, we are so much more than what we think or how we perceive ourselves to be. And that is certainly a takeaway that I've had of my near-death experience, where we are so much smaller than what we think, and there's so much more around us that on the other side that we have our blinders on or forget. Um, so that's certainly something I hope people could take away when they hear my near-death experience. But we have a phrase that says we are infinite spiritual beings having a human experience.
Right.
So we're going to really break that down. What does that mean? So an infinite spirit could be of any chronological age. Chronological age does not identify soul age. Sometimes there could be more congruency when people are at an older age and they have like an older disposition, or people are younger and stuff like that. But I think people have to remind themselves that beyond the chronology, there's a
Mm-hmm.
different dichotomy of the soul within that body, and that's important to bear in mind.
It is. And when you talk about, I've heard you speak about your NDE experience, and I know that every NDE is unique to the person, which also fascinates me. It's not the same. I don't know why it fascinates me because we are all unique. So we would have our own unique experience. But I know that for you, you were met with your past life, which I think is really fascinating. You were also with your team of guides. I call them a team, but your guides and angels. So it's sort of like you experience something, obviously, that we all kind of want to, but not in a good way. Can you talk a little bit about what happened there and what you took back from that? I know it's a child, so how do you put words to that? But you can, I'm assuming that you're bringing back and it's still kind of within you now, like it's still transforming in some sense because of those experiences. So, can you talk about that with us? I know it's a big subject, but
Oh no,
what do you think?
I love going there. And you do mention, because we're using symbols and language, all these linear
Mhm.
terminologies, even light itself, the light that we have on the planet is really based off of the rays of the sun.
Right.
And so when you're on the other side, it's not based off of the sun, it's based off of the light of the universe or God or whatever term you want to depict to it. So,
Mhm.
there's things that are so much more beyond this reality. But yes, in my near-death experience, what I'll say is, when you do cross over, like imagine the highest moment that you've ever had in your life, whether that was a great meal, a great time with a relative, a holiday, whatever that be, a graduation, a wedding, whatever that is. Some people that might be the worst day, but it's imagine the apex of your life that you've had, the highest point, the most climactical point that you could have. And imagine that multiplied by an infinite rate, an
Mm.
infinite number, and that there's no like comparison. When you think about it, we're bioneurochemical, and so we're in the body, we have a brain, and so there's a little bit of a damping on how almost high we could go,
Right.
unless we're out of our body, which I've had subsequently 20 years after my NDE, which is a whole other story. But in the body, there's like almost like a certain, cap that you could almost hit. When you're on the other side, there's no end to euphoria. And that's what I
Mm.
experienced. And to me, the endless source of euphoria, of love, of creation, of creative source, to me, in our terms that we use, which has a religious connotation, is often associated with the term God. But to me, it's just where all of life stems from. And the origin of that is utmost jubilation, joy, euphoria, a timelessness, a place where there's no worries or
Mm.
concerns or sadness. I mean, sure, there's a thought energy that, may arise as you adjust to it, but there's a point of this reality where there's no end to a greater joy or greater love and euphoria. And that's what I experience, fully on the other side. Beyond that, there were just kind of transmitters of this love. We call them angels and, spirit guides that I had. Some might call them guardian angels. I know more so in the UK and other parts of the world, they might have different terms of it. But, when I saw all these beings, they were right in front of me directly.
Mm.
It wasn't like I was thinking it or wasn't like a Claire kind of thing. It was just looking right in my peripherals, right in front of me directly. And, there was an adjustment phase where I was just like, holy crap, like it was just like too much to handle,
Yeah.
because, people think once you just go to the other side, you're right there. But there's an adaptation, there's an adjustment. Sure, you're returning to home, there's a familiarity to it. But I mean, think about it when I don't know, you're going like 100 miles an hour and you have to go like 500 miles an hour. It takes a little bit of time to like get up to
Yeah.
speed and get used to that feeling, no matter what you are. So, but to me, guardian angels are beings that are here before we come here. We're contracted with them. They're the closest extensions of who we are. When I saw my guardian angels, my spirit guides, they were right to the sides of me. There was a male and female guide. To this day, I don't know why. It's the one detail of my NDE that I'm not 1000% certain of, which is their individualized names. In that moment, it was crystal clear. I just call them the guides to this day. I mean, sometimes I feel like this is their name, but in that moment, I'm like, I knew their names.
Mm.
It's the one component of my NDE that isn't so much like 100%, 1000%, of their names. But when I saw them, you know, the analogy that I have is, just imagine the most beautiful being on the planet. Like for me, it was like Demi Moore in her prime, whatever, something like that, or I don't know, David Beckham, whatever. Just
Mm.
imagine that, and imagine the amount of respect, admiration, infatuation that you have with that being. Imagine that times like a billion, and imagine that feeling is towards you. That
Oh.
that feeling and that degree of pedestal, or just how you feel like the million miles away. And imagine that that being has that towards yourself.
Mm.
And that's the way I felt with the spirit guides, the degree of respect and love and care, and how beautiful they were. They saw that in myself. And I want for viewers to remind themselves we are so much more than what we think. And the other side, we're seen in such a different light than how we see ourselves. It's comical how we just rip ourselves to shreds and have a small perceptional viewpoint of who we are. When we're on the other side, we're seen in such a different light. And that light is unconditional admiration, love, respect, care. It's just beyond almost anything that we've had. And even like the greatest experiences of love that we have here on the planet, it doesn't hold a candle to what happens over
Mm.
there and what I experience with my spirit guides. And so, yeah, and I saw angels literally floating also right in front of me. I saw my soul family team,
Mm.
but I had awareness of, a couple different past lives. The most recent one that I had most awareness of was evidentially read through a lot of different intuitives prior to ever me saying a word publicly about my near-death experience. So that to me gave
Interesting.
me evidential, anecdotal information that this was real, because I'm a Taurus. I'm a biggest skeptic. Like in order for anything to be valid, it needs to like implode in front of flames in front of me, and I'll still have my doubts. Like that's like the way that I am.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, in my past life, I certainly think had a lot to do with my near-death experience, as all of the life that we live has a lot to do. Not every lifetime that we live has a degree of correspondence with the current lives that we are at, but I think sometimes there's stronger resonance with the past life that we may have had with our current life that we're living today.
Do you subscribe then to the idea that if we didn't finish what was to be done by our choice, that we're going to come back to do that?
Yeah, I
Do
mean,
you,
certainly that's rooted in a lot of different belief systems. Some may call that dharma, karma,
right.
stuff like that. Some might associate the terminology of a school, which I try to shy
Yeah.
away from because I don't know about you, Kiera, but I was traumatized by school and the way the education system
Me too.
is. It
Yeah,
was not an education system, it was a regurgitation system, and one of the biggest scams of my life. But it
definitely.
taught me a lot of radical acceptance and understanding that things are the way that they are, and the concept of flexibility, acceptance, making the most of. But what actually came out of that, outside of a lot of English literature, which I found, really spoke to me, it just was a waste of my time. It really didn't make sense. But that's a whole other can of worms. But I think the term school is often associated with life, and I said there's a lot of negative association, but I think it's just opportunity, an opportunity to really expand, to evolve, to grow. Um, and it's not out of necessity, but it's just to become a grander expression of who we really are and more of a uniformal expression of who we are, which is, a creation of God, which is a divine spark, to be
Absolutely.
closer to that, being. And each lifetime we have the ability to become closer, further away from that, light. And, my past life was a lifetime which I had my back against the wall. Like there was a great hubris, like everything just became like crashing down. There was no hope. And I just remembered being in like a building, people around me, and people telling me, no, no, no. And I just completed suicide in that last lifetime because I
Hmm.
saw, again, I was drowning. There was nothing to hold on to. There was no hope. So again, I could understand, clients, but more importantly, it had correspondence with my near-death experience, a lifetime later, where again, I was suffocated. There was nothing to hold on to. I
Yeah.
thought this was it. I'm screwed. I'm at the lowest point of life. And all of a sudden, through the power of surrender to a
Mm,
greater breath beyond this body, which, and I say in my tradition, the Jewish tradition, the word for spirit is just translated as the wind of God, the breath of God. And through really surrendering to this breath of eternity, I was able to transition from pure darkness to pure elation. And that exact framework, drives the work that I do each and every day as a therapist. And why I become public with my work is to really give back people and to remind people that they're eternal, but to really give back that breath of hope, that breath of salvation when they feel that's been taken from them. And it's through the power of surrender that I was able to find that, breath in that
I
moment.
also find it very interesting that in your last life, as you expressed, you did feel hopeless, like there wasn't anything, there was no purpose, just as we started this podcast, interestingly.
Mm.
Um, and now you do that in service. You work with that in service,
Yeah.
which is kind of an interesting correlation, whether you believe in life after death or near death. But if you're listening to this, I'm assuming that you do. It's just fascinating that here you are again on the other end of it, though,
Oh, yeah.
having
Yeah.
empathy and compassion for those who are actually in that
You know,
or
people
potentially in that
people ask all the time, how do I find my purpose? And there's many ways to find, I'm sure you asked that as well.
all the time.
And I think joy is a part of it. Obviously, the analogy that I have, which is a great statement by the late Dr. Wayne Dyer, is he was once asked, who or what is God? And he said, God is found in enthusiasm. And they asked, like, what do you mean by that? And enthusiasm, the Greek word is entheos, which just means the God within. And so when you have joy, That's a way of connecting to the divine or God. And people sojourn and they read religious texts at nauseum. They go to extensive extents, but it's through finding joy that we are aligning ourselves with divinity. But I also think on the inverse of that, oftentimes pain is something that accompanies our purpose. They go hand in hand. And I
Hmm.
think when we're able to really identify our greatest bit of pain, that could be something that might have expedited or influenced our purpose, or that particular genre of pain that we experience is now a driving force for the purpose that we do. As you've seen a lot of parents who tragically might have lost kids for, fentanyl overdose or, different types of, tragedies that has championed their cause and what they're doing today. And now from that dark night of the soul, they're influencing so many others. And I'm certain that they would rather have it the other way and their kids still be alive, but they're using, that dark night, those moments to really transform their lives. And that's, I think what drove my life in many ways. And I think all of life is really a training school to be a guide. And so we go through different things at certain points within this life and after this life. And I think there's a purpose for it for us to understand someone down the road who's a couple exits before we were, to
Yeah.
really be able to help them out, and to walk, beside them from going through those same paths that we might have, gone through, and those same struggles that only we could understand.
Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of things that you've said. I want to go back to this NDE, the feeling of love times a billion. And that is one thing that seems to be consistent among NDEers. It doesn't matter who it is or what experience they've had, they all seem to be different, except for this one,
Mm.
which is unconditional love that you can't even imagine, like you don't even know. And that's what you all seem to come back with, is that remembering that that is available for you and that somehow we have forgotten. Yet you also talked about school and your experience with school, which was mine as well. But I feel that in school, we are beginning to be taught to forget that. This is where we learn to forget that we are loved or that we are an expression of love. We are taught very early to forget all of those, which is why mediumship, NDE, past life regression, all of this is just poo pooed because it has been trained out of us and we have to return to it to find it again, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, and and so I'm not certainly one to knock religion. I myself, proud Jewish man, grew up in that family and that, culture, and I honor that. But that again, that's a part of my story. But I do think religion without spirituality is a whole great deal of control,
Hmm.
and a lot of different mechanisms at hand. But I also think our beliefs in this reality totally influence our ideologies on God.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so, what's God? We oftentimes compare it with an authority figure, a policeman, a principal, maybe an its abusive parent that he might have had, and that
Hmm.
is God, and that's all we can understand. And so, God is often depicted in many religious texts as an unconditional being of love, and yet there's jealousy, there's wrath, there's,
Redemption.
you have, yeah, all these like, yeah, god awful qualities that I wouldn't invite myself to be friends with, bear alone a god to have. And so I think really people get stuck in the stories that they have and how those may influence their understanding of God because there's nothing to really compare it to. I think we could have small tastes of it, but not the full story. And those small tastes are kind of like the people who give us unconditional love to a degree and thinking that
Mm.
we know it and you know God. It's kind of like going to an airport and thinking you know the city. Like, you've kind of like go there at the precipice, but you don't know what the heck that city has to offer. You have like a small sample size of it,
Yeah.
so, but I think really we, at our core, God is not outside of us. It's not a being thousands of miles away. It's what we have inside of us. We all have that spark of divinity. And by remembering that and being able to embody that as well, how we become more uniformal to that which what we are. I
Hmm.
think people start
Yeah.
to look for God, and that's one thing, but to embody God is how we know God within our actions, within who we are, and to start to see that world through that God lens, which is a lot easier said than done. I mean, I find myself having very human moments, and that's a part of it. No one's immunized from that. But again, that needs to be that Polaris for people to have that transition from belief to embodiment within their
Mm,
lives.
well said. I feel like that directly correlates to mediumship as well. It's like we have this idea that there's this entity out there that we're talking to, and it's so separate from us. Yet we have this conversation about everything is one, we're all one. But then we separate this one thing that is so much us, meaning if I want to tap into the spirit world, it's just tapping into consciousness, which is all available at all times. Yet we want to humanize it and separate it and say, oh, well, we have to go find it. We have to go look for the spirit person. We have to do all of these things to get there. And I know I'm going to get a lot of backlash about that, but it's true. We don't need the rituals. We don't need the protection. We're not protecting against anything but love. Why would I protect myself from that? But tapping into that consciousness, that greater within, is what I really experience with mediumship. So it's like my essence has to connect with an essence. And it's kind of similar in that. The difference is that that essence that comes in is coming from pure love consciousness. So that's usually felt in mediumship.
Yeah, and there's a whole abusive dynamic that comes with a lot of spirituality and religion.
Yeah.
What's required in abusive dynamics is to have a very small sense of self, a dependency, on
Mm,
something external, and to be very disempowered in how you view
yeah.
things. And we've been conned in a way to see ourselves as these small things dependent on all these things externalized, that it's in the power of the few, not in the hands of the many. And so I think if more people were really to reframe where they're looking at, the direction that they're looking at, instead of looking externally, to look internally and to start to see themselves as really the doorway to really open this up, and to understand that you don't need to be complex on a human level to experience a greater complexity of reality. In fact, some of the most simple people on a personality standpoint have made the most extraordinary connections. I mean, certainly, obviously, Edgar Cayce comes to mind, and a
Right.
lot of different prophets who might have been very human and relatable, but they were able to just get themselves out of the way and surrender to a greater truth. And so, two things could be true at the same time. At a human level, we might be very simple on one level, but on a true level, in our purest form, we are very complex. And we have an awareness to this, amazing world. We all have that because we all are a divine spark.
Yeah. So well said. And you also said something that directly relates to mediumship, which is get themselves out of the way enough. And with mediumship, you have to get yourself out of the way enough to get somebody else to communicate. The more in it you are, the worse that reading is going to go for you. So it actually also relates in that way. I'm interested in your past life regression. I know you are a hypnotherapist, you do hypnotherapy, which I have a passion for as well, but I've never really gotten so much into past life because I'm an evidential medium. So it's like I don't deal with that. I wouldn't even know where to start. But I find it fascinating, of course. I'm not convinced I understand enough to say whether I even believe, but I want to ask you, you had this experience, which definitely was true for you. And then you came back, became a hypnotherapist, and you specialize in this. So can you tell me what is that benefit? You spoke a little bit about it in terms of like now you're here doing the same thing on the other side, which is endlessly amazing. But what do you think people are like if I got a past life regression, I know what I would maybe experience because I've had them before, but what do you think that would do for me as the client? Like, what's your passion in that? How does that help me?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the why in whatever we do is pivotal. The why gets us to the
Yeah.
how and the what. It all started really subsequently after my NDE. I had a lot of awareness of many things, and those past life memories kept on coming up to me. And they
Mm.
were oftentimes distressing. Like I remember just being on a baseball mound and having past life memories, or just some random situation having all
Mm.
these past life memories. And really, I theorized that my brain, was deprived of oxygen. It totally shut down in my near-death experience. Subsequently, my mind was open because my brain wasn't in the way as much. And so there's
Yeah.
that whole brain-mind dichotomy, which, is another can of worms, but the two are the two exist despite, the brain does not produce the mind. But for myself, that was like a painful experience having all these traumas come up and not being able to have like a term for it or whatever. And so for myself, again, that pain just wanted me to kind of give over to those clients to be able to normalize it and to use the ability to go to some of those wounds to have healing so that people
Mm.
are able to live a more conscious life instead of an unconscious or subconscious life, and to really be able to be more present, in this lifetime. But I think it really, I would say, has a lot of parallels with the work that you do, which is not necessarily an intent or not, but it gives clients an evidence that A, we
Oh,
are more than our body, and B, we don't die.
yeah.
Because when you have a past life, and many times during the regressions, clients will visit the time in which the soul left their body, and they'll just come off with something they might have believed in to a direct knowing that we go
Mm.
on beyond this body. We are not this body. I have such a bigger story beyond this. And you could do so much with that for a mental health perspective that could foster a lot of resilience in a sense that you understand the temporary nature of pain and how that could help people to ride the wave of their lives a little bit more, knowing that the corner may be bumpy, but the ending, is in existence, and the ending is absolutely fine, but it's eternal. That allows people to kind of navigate some of the, turns of their lives that might have been bumpy, understanding that in the end, in the macrocosm of things, things will progress, things will evolve. It's the same thing in my near-death experience. By looking at suffocation and darkness in its purest form, I was able to see and find a light of eternity beyond that.
Yeah.
And so I think really the more people's belief system is rooted in truth, the more that they're able to navigate the GPS of their lives. But there's so much to it from just a social standpoint. I mean, obviously, understanding family dynamics, interpersonal dynamics, understanding, tendencies that we may have. Obviously, from a health perspective, we've seen a lot of case studies of people who develop reoccurring health circumstances that
Wow.
are not explainable by medical doctors, or even at the very least, blemishes or bruises. And that, pertains to a theory or a phenomenon called cellular memory, which, we
Yeah.
have different subconscious memories and that replicates itself into the body. But I've seen a lot of people who have experiences or worldviews or circumstances that are not able to be justified or explained by just this one lifetime. And
Mhm.
for them, they come with a lot more answers and questions before, usually. So there's a closure which allows them to navigate and propel this life to greater heights.
That is really interesting. So they're coming back on a cellular level, experiencing health issues.
Mhm.
That's something I'd never heard before. I've heard the other things that you mentioned, but that's kind of incredible.
Oh,
But
yeah.
also that idea of repeating kind of a trauma in a way, I suppose, like mental as well. Isn't that something that you've talked about as well? Like people coming back with kind of similar um,
Yeah.
feelings or traumas, or I don't know how I'm trying to say that, but yeah.
Yeah. Phobias, traumas,
Ah,
things
okay,
that are just
phobias.
not be able to be explained at all in this lifetime. And again, they're able to go right to it, understanding the source, and therefore they're able to find some healing explanation. Like I said before, the scientific community, and right now that's kind of expanding to more of higher consciousness and
Mhm.
God, really will say if you look at anything closely enough, everything has a reasoning or some degree of an explanation behind it. If you look hard and closely enough and you're open-minded enough. And I think the same pertains to mental health. But obviously, that's there and the wound is there, but the ability to find healing and understanding for that point of pain, is pivotal in what clients
Yeah,
may go through. But yeah, I mean, I'll give a short story just to kind of
definitely.
exemplify some of the physical characteristics that people may have. Um, Obviously you're aware of Dr. Brian Weiss. He wrote, the
Yes.
best-selling book, Many Lives, Many Masters,
Yeah.
Yale-trained psychiatrist, brilliant man, total left brain guy. I don't, I'm sure his
Hmm.
story is fascinating in terms of how he came about it. But, the example I want to illustrate is his daughter is also a fellow social worker. So yeah, Brian Weiss's daughter was a fellow social worker. And sometimes when your dad is a famous star, whatever, you just kind of know him as dad. You don't get involved as much with his work or what he does. You just kind of see him as dad. So I guess she was just like, all right, I'm gonna like try to go to one of his regressions and just kind of see what this is all about, whatever. She's
Oh,
like open-minded to it. And from my understanding, and maybe I'm a little bit off of some of the details, but the main points I know I'm on, she went to it. And before this, I think she was about to have surgery on her eyes, like a cataracts type surgery, because she had a lot of vision problems. And she's probably relatively young at the time. And so she went to his regression, and during the regression, she just remembered a life, I think, when she was burned in the eyes, and that happened in the last life. And from going there, finding the healing, being able to really speak to that pain, understanding where it came from, she got out of that and her vision was totally fine. She didn't need the procedure and she was totally fine. And that's just one of the many examples of just from a physical health, transition that people have. It just kind of has you to really understand how really in many ways the body is just a great mirror of the higher mind,
mm,
and what it may carry. And so it's amazing to see that in so many other cases. Children in particular um, have a lot of clear past life
yeah.
memories because when you
Yeah.
think of it, kids aren't as conditioned. They're a lot more
Hmm.
fresh from the other side. And
Yep.
so oftentimes kids will have a lot of past life memories. I know I was heavily influenced by a book by an author named Carol Bowman, who was
Yeah.
on the Oprah Winfrey Show, and her son Chase was having all these nightmares about a life, I think, in the Civil War and stuff like that. And it was like causing a lot of, terrors and night terrors and stuff like that. And he was regressed and he's able to kind of remember that life. And all of a sudden, he's able to have a differentiation with that was then and this is now. And he was able to be more present in his life and finding healing from what happened before. So, it's amazing. But some of these things, if you're not able to address, that moment could really, just kind of salvage a whole lifetime and just not allow people to live their fullest life from finding the healing and having people kind of regurgitate, that lifetime to not be as present in this lifetime. So it's amazing in what it can do and the ability for people to really take ownership of this lifetime, to be in the groove of this lifetime and not to live an unconscious life or just a regurgitation of another lifetime. While also it could really envelop a lot of greater gifts and understanding. I had a guest a couple weeks ago on my channel, and she was regressed by Brian, and all of a sudden her intuitive and mediumistic abilities exploded to the
Hmm.
point where now she is an incredible evidential medium. But not only that, after the regression with Brian, someone came up to her. She just started doing a reading on this person, and the person responded, said, I was about to complete suicide after,
Yeah.
that weekend. If things didn't change, your reading and your words changed my life. It completely blew me away. And that's what started her in her path. And so, you just don't know what could happen when you go within and the gifts that you could find and how much is there, which is so incongruent with the stories that we've been told. We've been programmed to say, oh, get this car, get this house, get
Oh,
all these
yeah.
things outside of you, and you'll be good. And that leads to a midlife crisis.
Oh, what it's guaranteed, basically.
Uh,
I am so happy to hear you say this because I know I went through a past life regression once, which I didn't really experience much. And I'm not going to blame that on the person. I don't know why or what happened or what it was probably me. But hearing you say there's so much potential healing if you can get there, and tap back into that consciousness that we've been speaking of in today is really enlightening, because that is really therapy. It is why we're doing what we're doing, in service, or you, I would imagine, right? So you're saying like you have this great potential to see the reality of who your soul is, and heal some of this current trauma that you have been carrying and you just didn't know. And if you don't even see that trauma, you would understand there's a greater consciousness, which is mediumship as well. Like we're just proving a greater consciousness. We're all kind of trying to do this work in different ways. Even among mediums, we're all doing different work, aren't we? But I love that you say that's your drive for it, because it makes me now want to go back and do it again, because I'm like, oh, I get that now. Instead of just this idea of what did I do? Who was I? Wouldn't that be interesting? Which it would, but I would love to have that perspective of the greater consciousness, or me as a greater consciousness, and experience that for a moment. So I love that. So I'm so happy to hear that you're doing that with people and helping people in that way. I know I had a client once that was telling me that, speaking of young children, her son had remembered a past life, or she didn't know this, but she was speaking about it. And I was like, oh, that's his past life,
Mhm.
because he kept saying to her, are you my new mommy now? And she was like, what are you saying? And he's like, I don't want you to leave. You're much nicer than my other mommy. Can you be my mommy forever?
Mm. Wow. Wow.
And she was just like, what is he talking about? And I was like, his past life. He's speaking about a past life, that he doesn't understand how to communicate with you, because he's a very young child. I think he was like 3, but he still obviously remembered. And so she was trying to ask me, like, what do I say? Because this is a greater consciousness question, isn't it? Like, will you always be my mommy? Like, how can we have these experiences? But it is fascinating. And I also know with children, most of them at least forget that part of them. So you talked about a man who remembered and was able to change his life with the Civil War,
Mhm.
experience. But a lot of the children actually forget that they even spoke about their past life with their parents.
Oh yeah, when they become older, yeah, and
Yeah.
it could lead to a lot of role dysphoria or just complexity. If you were to remember the different roles that we had in our stages of our life. I mean, geez, I mean, I work in the mental health field with a lot of kids, and you wonder why these kids are so defiant or
Mm,
oppositional. I
yeah.
mean, I don't know about you, but if I had my younger brother becoming my parent, like I'd be pretty defiant too, or one of my kids becoming my parents, like that would be a hard pill for me to swallow. And so I think, I theorize obviously from a mental health perspective, oppositional defiant disorder is often associated with ADHD because my theory is, I mean, if ADHD, people are constantly telling you, calm down, stop it. And so you're
Hmm.
going to push back against that. You're constantly being corrected or, geez, there's a better word for it, but, monitored or corrected. And so I think, but also beyond that, though, kids at times have a hard time on some level accepting the changes, afterwards. I know I certainly did. There was a pre-perception that I had of my parents, and then a post-NDE perception that I had where, I put them as kind of like these all-knowing beings before my NDE. And it's not to knock who they were, but after I had my NDE, I just knew like they didn't understand everything. They were human
Mm,
beings. And
right.
that was like deflating. And even afterwards, my father told me, who's also a therapist, I came up to him and I said, hey, Dad, I'm just using my words, something profound happened to me. One day you'll understand it, but right now you're not going to. So I'm not going to talk about what happened when I went to the hospital and was rushed by the ambulance. And that was hard, because
Mm,
we're like these small bodies and we're looking at these parents as these elder beings, but many kids oftentimes feel in some ways they're older and wiser than their parents,
yeah.
which is very awkward and kind of weird. Because again, the body does not associate itself with wisdom or age from a spiritual perspective. Maybe in the human journey, sure, but
Mhm.
sometimes kids could feel like I'm the older one, you're the younger one. And sometimes you see that pattern occurring where kids unfortunately will take over the home, which is every parent's worst nightmare, and they'll be the parent and stuff like that. And the parent will lose that boundary, and that's hard. But I think a lot of times those kids might be used to being the parent, and it's hard for them to accept that role as a kid.
Definitely. And I think I've thought about this a lot as a child. I remember feeling like people were wearing these masks and they weren't telling the truth. And because I could feel the truth and I could see that. Because they would say they were okay, but I could see that they were hurting inside or they were angry or they were devastated. And but I was very confused because people kept telling me to tell the truth. You're supposed to tell the truth in this world. You need to be truthful. My mother would always say that. But I was like, then why isn't anybody else telling the truth?
Mm.
Why isn't anybody saying that they don't feel good when they don't?
Oh yeah,
Why do adults lie then? And I remember feeling very angry that this world was a lie, that people were actively lying about everything. I could see so many lies and I think eventually shut it down because I was like, this is painful. I don't like seeing this anymore. And then yet I come into this work and here I can see it again.
right.
Now I come back to I can see the essence of the person and I don't this mask that you're wearing is really nothing anymore. I mean, you can do it. We all do it. We're all putting it on in the morning, but it isn't actually the truth most of the time.
Right. But what are we brainwashed from day one? We're brainwashed to be
Yeah.
normal. That's the pedestal of success as a kid. And as you get older, you realize the coolest thing you could do is to be weird and different, because that means you're making a difference, you know?
Yeah.
And so it's a great place to be in, where all of a sudden your uniqueness, what's maybe strange or odd or different about you, is embraced. I mean, when I was younger, I was just called weirdo in kindergarten all the time because I guess I was always dreaming or I wasn't focused. I was just kind of different. And I certainly think Mindy had a lot to do with that. But I would go to like great extents just to get quiet so I could have these conversations, with the higher realms. I felt a lot more comfortable over there than over here, and a lot more stimulated and entertained by what was over there than was over here. These boring kids playing in blocks, like, picking their nose was not too enticing compared to, the angels on the other side. But I had to kind of learn that, hey, that radical acceptance piece, again, it's not fair. I don't agree with it. I don't like this, but it kind of is what it is. And it's kind of how Eckhart Tolle starts. If you read, I think his book is like A New Earth or something like that, where he starts, one of the prelogues, whatever. He speaks about the differentiation of animals and humans, where
Mhm.
he speaks about where animals, if their terrain is threatened or they're impoverished or they have a famine, they're not just going to sit there and say, this isn't fair, I don't like this, F this. They're going to
Yes.
migrate, they're going to adapt, and they're going to do the best they can to survive. Human beings are different. When there's things that we don't like or things that aren't working, we just kind of sit there instead of trying to find another way and another pathway, to handle that. And so I think if anything out of this conversation is to be successful, you have to be flexible, adaptable, and understand the power of the mind is the influence of your reality. It really is. You know,
The power of the mind is the influence of your
is a
reality.
key to your reality. I think people want to change the reality, and I say, don't focus on the outside, focus on your mind. Your reality is just the mirror of your mind, and that's rooted in A Course in Miracles and a lot of other
Hmm.
principles. But we're all just a lot of people take ownership of this stuff, but we're all just hitting on the same points, and
Yeah.
I don't believe
Oh,
in a
yeah.
monopolization or a VIP for being a wordsmith of God. It's we all connect to the same stuff, but there's just kind of like some people carry their worldviews into spirituality. It's just kind of comical how people have their VIP necklaces on and think that they're the
Absolutely.
ownership or ambassadors of this stuff. And I'd say there's enough of the abundance of the pie to go around for everyone to enjoy, but it's not anyone's to hold on to. It's for us to let go of, you know.
Absolutely. And that's so well said. It's sort of like if we all know this, then nobody gets to say they're the one that brought it to you. Like it's actually if we are speaking about God or consciousness or whatever label you want to put on it,
Right.
we all inherently know this. So we can't say, "Oh, I'm the one that brought it to you," though,
Yeah.
because we actually just forgot through our schools and our government or whatever it is that we went through. I want to share something really quickly about your daydreaming. I find that really interesting because I was given many tests as a child on my hearing because I would just space out and I wasn't hearing anybody when I was doing that. So I was like this crazy daydreamer, apparently. But they just thought it was so bizarre, the teachers, that they started testing me for my intelligence. And now it was a hearing test, and now it's a learning disorder test. And I didn't have any of it. And they just literally could not understand why I would be like that. And so I was just I was just labeled like, well, she just doesn't pay attention. So I just think it's interesting that you share that you were the weirdo and the daydreaming child when so many of the kids, this is what we naturally should be doing is daydreaming. And yes, we need to have our education. I understand that. But we also need to understand that that's the reality of a child is we're living in this world of consciousness
Yeah.
that we forgot.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I think to this day, a large part of our awareness is still over there, and a very
yeah.
small percentage of our awareness is over here. Some might call it the higher self, the superconscious, whatever you may call it. There's a lot, you want to say England, you want to say Great Britain, UK, it's all the same descriptive of the same idea. But I think for kids especially, they're a lot more over there than over here. And even if they are over here, it's like, I don't know, if I had my mind on like a great dish and you gave me like oatmeal, I'm not gonna like focus on the oatmeal. Like my mind's gonna be over there, and some things are just not as enticing. It's just like they're focused on a lot more things with more depth and beauty. At the same time, though, kids have an incredible creative side to them where they could take these things that we look at as adults, where it's like this is absolutely nothing, and find like a whole universe and excitement about it. So I think the elements of kids, and I consider myself an ambassador for kids having this experience, is to never let go of that curious side, that adventurous side, that parts of us that could just look at one thing and transmute it to a whole different world, you know?
Definitely. And I don't know how much time you have, but I do want to touch on those books of yours. Can you hold those up for the viewers? And just, I know you've got a
Yeah,
newer one, The Wisdom of
these are,
Jacob's Ladder and Life After Breath. And Life After Breath, I believe, was the first.
yeah, they
Yes.
both
Okay.
came in a 3 year span. And it's funny where I see my name on it because I just see this as a compilation of so many people behind me here and over
Mm.
there.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm a very unlikely candidate on paper to be an author of two books. I mean, just 10 to 15 years, no, I'd say around 10 years before my books were published, I was in the lowest possible course for community college in writing and reading. They had two tracks for remedials, and I was in the bottom of the barrel for those courses. And for me, this book just is an inspiration, hopefully to others, is to say that if other people tell you that they're limited, that's not your limitation, that is theirs. And I think we all have an unlimited quality to us, and to never let anyone tell you who you are. And I just remember applying to like high schools, and my sister was one of the top tier students. Now, she works as a teacher, whatever, but I'm the author of the family, but she was a star golden child. And the principal just looked at one of my pieces of writing and she says, "How are you your sister's sibling? We're not going to accept you into the school, yet you're not of quality."
Wow.
And most of my kids, they're doing fine lives, but they're working in hedge funds, whatever. And I'm the only author that I know of in my school's history and this, the bubble of community that I grew up in, because I was able to use a lot of that doubt, a
Mm-hmm.
lot of that just small-mindedness. That's something that really flustered me about how people govern their lives. Just remember that you are unlimited. You have unlimited potential. Don't ever anyone tell you who you are. You hold those keys. And we come from God, who is an unlimited being. And anyone who tells you they're unlimited, that is more of a reflection on them than a reality that you are. So hope that people take that with them, that
I
we
hope so
all have
too.
unlimited, we are all unlimited. And I'm sure you've seen it through the transformations people had with their bodies as well.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I used to be almost 200 pounds. I was constantly teased for being overweight. I was on a lot of psychiatric medications to treat a lot of this trauma that I had, that
Mm.
anxiety, and I wasn't able to sleep. But you know, in my book, I stated this where I had one of the best looking girls in my school came up to like a friend of mine and she said, yeah, hey, if Jake, lost a few pounds, he'd be a good-looking guy. And at the time, that hurt like hell. But it
Right.
reminded me that I wasn't this being, that I was beautiful underneath it all. And from that belief system, my behaviors all of a sudden changed, that I am perfect and beautiful just as I am. And my behaviors followed that. And I think if more people would remind themselves that they're not this pathology, they are beautiful, they'll change a lot of their behavioral patterns to reflect their belief systems, you know?
I'm definitely clipping this piece out because this needs to be broadcasted to the world. Um, I want to say that actually goes right in line with what you said before this with your mind. Your mind can change everything for you and your limited beliefs. And this goes with maybe the coined phrase that's been overused, the law of attraction. And I think there's a lot of debate on what people mean by that, but the simple term being, you have a belief about yourself and you live your life in that way. Well, then now it's starting to reflect back to you and you start to feel differently. Um,
It's
right?
it's amazing. And look, the planet could be one planet, but if you change and how you see yourself, the whole world is different. And
Right.
I don't know about you, but just like when I'm connected or in a good zone, I'll have the same meal, the same music, but if I'm in that zone, everything is amplified. So I think a lot of
Yes.
people focus on the physical things, but it's really energy that will allow us to transmute and change, and have a different experience here on planet Earth. You know.
Absolutely. And you also there's so much in this interview, but you talked about midlife crisis, the cars, the houses, even the women and the men. But I know I worked with a lot of those people, to be honest, when I was doing my fitness, and they were some of the most unhappy people. And I will tell you, the worst ones were the ones that had inherited money and didn't need to work.
Mm,
And so they felt this lack. They had everything physically, but they didn't have service.
mm,
They didn't have this feeling of purpose. And I don't mean they found their purpose and now everything's great. I just mean they didn't feel that they had a purpose. Everything had been handed to them and they were so comfortable and beautiful, whatever. But inside, they
mm,
were so sad and depressed. And many of them were on medications or going to psychiatric units, taking mental health breaks from their life, which they often didn't work. So that shows you quite a bit about the side of physical or getting physical things in your life and how that's not
mm.
going to make you happy at all.
Yeah.
And seemingly you would think, well, their mindset must be fabulous, but it really wasn't. So that's not really what they were getting,
Oh
right?
yeah, sure. I mean, obviously from a mental health perspective, having your basic needs are paramount, to really having that solid foundation.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
beyond that, I'm sure we know there are people who have everything and have nothing, and people who have nothing and have everything. And
Hmm.
and again, it really has to do with who we are is a soul.
Yeah.
And if you're neglecting the soul, if you're not listening to it, if you're just entertaining the body and materialism, you're depriving that voice and you're creating a great void. And it's important to really understand who you are, that we are a soul having a physical experience and to do things that really elevate your soul and to entertain it and to really nurture the soul.
How do you think in your mind, how do we find our true nature of the soul? Like, what would you say to someone about that?
Yeah, it comes
How do I
back to
find
that.
that?
Comes back to that Wayne Dyer thing where I talked about enthusiasm, but I'm sure you could
Mhm.
attest with this. Like I get readings and my grandfather's always like the first one to come in. And what is he doing on the other side? He's fishing. And for
Mm.
some people, they'd be like, well, that's not spiritual. He's not burning incense or lining his chakras or, having all these things. So that is not spirituality. That's something physical or just something trivial. But I think really the other side, we continue what we're passionate about over here. In other words, our heaven is over here and the things that we do over here. So I think for people to really understand and to not diminish what you're passionate about over here. For me, it seems like hell on earth sometimes, but I am like a lifelong diehard New York Jets fan. It's torture. We're a bad team. It's taught me unconditional love, but that's what I love. I love sports. I love exercise. I love running. I love nature. That's me.
Mhm.
Everyone has a different engine. And I think it's important to not push that aside, to really just see that as trivial, but to see that as a part that makes you you in this lifetime. And you'll continue that when you do cross over, if it's golf, if it's baseball, if it's, synchronized swimming, whatever the heck that is. Find that thing that makes you elevated and really own that thing in this life, and it's hard when you have clinical depression where almost you do nothing, and that's something that's a different thing because that's certainly bioneurochemical. But I think we could all have something that could slightly elevate our life, and if there's progress to a degree, you're doing something good. It doesn't have to be euphoric or whatever, but just these small things that are really in the big picture, big things.
Absolutely. And I will say I don't feel like just because you're aligning chakras or burning incense or whatever, that doesn't mean spirituality at all to me, at least. I think people claim that you need to
Right,
be in touch with those things. But I know some pretty ugly people that do that and they claim to be spiritual and they're nowhere near what I would consider spiritual, which is love, isn't it?
right.
So wouldn't that be just a way to access love if you wish,
Mhm.
but you can find love in fishing? We could, I
Yeah,
mean, maybe even more
sure.
because we're sitting in nature and we're paying so close attention to our um what's going on energetically around us because we have to.
People fall in love with tools and roads, but not the destination. And I think each of
Exactly.
our destination is unique. So it's not the ayahuasca that did anything, or the incense or this. All it did was invoke something in you.
In you. Yeah.
And you can do that through, I found, like out of body experiences through running or sports. It just, all it
Hmm.
does is just different paths up to the mountain, different approaches, but it's leading to a similar point. And so everyone associates their spirituality with all these tools, but those are
Right.
just means to an end. It's like self-identifying yourself with a car or a house. Like these are just tools, but they get you to that point. So I think that's important to bear in mind that to me, spirituality is based off of this life and the joy that you have, not so much like a set criteria boxed in with a
Absolutely.
couple different tools.
I think that's so interesting that you say that it's just a box of tools because now we're back to the car and the house again.
Right,
So,
right.
but we're just claiming that it's spirituality, but we're actually in the same trap.
Yeah, yeah.
We're still trapped by the same physical things that we want to be calling our life. So fascinating, isn't it?
Interestingly enough, I know my grandfather was coming through because he owned a tool business. And in fact, I was just wearing his company shirt
Oh,
last night. I never wear it, so it must have prepared me for this dialogue. But yeah, it's like we have all these tools and avenues, but they kind of get us to that point.
yeah. So well said. Well, Jacob, I want to thank you. And I also want to remind everyone that you have your own podcast. You have your own YouTube channel, The Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder, correct?
Wisdom Jacob's Ladder. It's on YouTube and a lot of different stations that people could find me. So yeah, we do weekly conversations, and I have a couple of my own videos there, so you can check me out there. I'm also on Instagram, Jacob Cooper LCSW, Facebook, the same. My website is jacoblcooper.com. And, both of my books they're both on Amazon,
Yep.
been endorsed by the likes of Dr. Emma Moody, Alison Dubois, Suzanne Giesemann, Anita Morjani, to name a few. So,
I
uh,
mean, these are big
yeah,
names. These are like really, like, I'm
yeah,
impressed.
they're both with a
Um,
publisher in California too. So it's pretty nice to be a
yeah,
published author. So,
it's lovely. I'm so happy and thank you so much for taking the time to join with me today. It's just been such a pleasure and an honor, and I can't wait to throw this up on YouTube for the world to see.
well, thank you. An honor,
Mm.
pleasure of conversation. Keep up the great
Yeah.
work.
Thank you. You too.